Some acts of cruelty cut so deep they demand justice, and sometimes that justice comes from the most unexpected places. In the frozen darkness above Deadwood Pass, a broke cowboy named Clay Jensen was just trying to survive another winter night. With nothing but a borrowed mule and frostbitten fingers, he was riding through a blizzard to earn a few dollars delivering a telegram. But what he found bound and dying in the snow would change everything. A massive German shepherd, tortured and staked out to freeze to death. No tracks, no witnesses, just suffering. Clay didn't think twice. He cut those ropes and risked his own life to save a dog that wasn't his. But what that dog would do the next morning, when a killer's trail went cold and the law had given up, would prove that mercy always finds a way to repay itself. How did a half-frozen dog lead them straight to evil's doorstep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Jensen had known better days. Hell, he'd known better years. But as he stood in the doorway of Dutch McGraw's trading post that December afternoon in 1891, watching snow fall like torn cotton over the Wyoming territory, he reminded himself that being alive was its own kind of fortune. The wind pushed against the door, rattling the frame. Clay turned his back to it, warming his hands over the potbelly stove that sat in the center of the room. The heat felt like a luxury he hadn't earned, considering he'd spent the last 2 months living on credit and goodwill. "You're thinking too hard again," Dutch called from behind the counter, his voice carrying that easy warmth that made him friends with everyone who walked through his door. "Can see it in your face, Clay. All them lines getting deeper." Clay managed a smile. Dutch McGraw was somewhere past 60, with a white beard that made children think of St. Nicholas and a barrel chest that suggested he'd been a formidable man in his youth. He'd run this trading post for 23 years, serving trappers, cowboys, prospectors, and the occasional outlaw who knew better than to cause trouble in Dutch's place. "Just contemplating my options," Clay said, "which are getting fewer by the day." "That why you're considering Jake Thornton's telegram job?" Dutch asked, setting down the ledger he'd been marking. "Because that's a fool's errand in this weather." Clay had known Dutch would say that. The old man had been saying variations of it for the past week, ever since Clay had mentioned he was thinking about taking any work that came available. But Dutch didn't understand what it felt like to be 37 years old with nothing but empty pockets and an empty cabin waiting up in the hills. "It's $3 and a hot meal," Clay said. "And Jake needs that telegram delivered to his brother over in Silverton before Christmas. Says it's important family business. Jake Thornton's family business is probably letting his brother know which card game he lost their mother's silver in," Dutch muttered, but there was no real heat in it. $3 won't do you much good if you freeze to death on Deadwood Pass. I've ridden worse trails in worse weather." That was true enough. Clay had been working cattle since he was 14 years old, back when his father still had the ranch down in Colorado. He knew cold weather, knew mountain trails, knew how to read the sky and the wind and make decisions that kept a man alive. But that was before he'd lost the ranch to debt, before he'd lost his wife Sarah to childbirth and the baby boy with her, before he'd spent 5 years drifting from one temporary job to another, watching his savings dwindle and his options narrow, like a trail running up into Dead-End Canyon. His father's pocket knife sat heavy in his coat pocket, the bone handle worn smooth from 2 generations of use. His father had carried it for 40 years, working cattle, mending tack, cutting rope. When the old man died, he'd left Clay the knife and the ranch and nothing else. Now the ranch was gone, sold to pay debts Clay hadn't even known existed. But he still had the knife, still had the initials TJ carved in the handle, Thomas Jensen, his father's name. It wasn't much of an inheritance, but it was something. The trading post door opened with a gust of wind and snow, and Margaret McGraw came in from the back room, carrying a basket of fresh bread that made Clay's stomach remind him he'd skipped breakfast. She was a solid woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and hands that were never still. "Clay Jensen, you tell me you're not seriously thinking about riding up to Silverton in this weather," she said. setting the basket on the counter. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm afraid I am." "Then you're as big a fool as my husband says you are," Margaret replied. But she was already cutting a thick slice of bread and spreading it with butter. She handed it to Clay without asking if he wanted it. "Eat that. You're too thin." Clay accepted the bread with genuine gratitude. Margaret McGraw had been feeding him in small ways for the past month, never making a show of it, always with some excuse about having extra or not wanting something to go to waste. He knew charity when he saw it, but he also knew better than to refuse kindness from good people. "The storm's supposed to break tomorrow," Clay said between bites. "Jake needs that telegram delivered by the 23rd. That gives me 2 days to make the ride, if I leave tonight." Dutch shook his head, but didn't argue further. He'd known Clay long enough to recognize when a man's mind was set. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. "If you're determined to be stubborn, then take this," Dutch said, handing Clay the paper. "It's a note to my cousin in Silverton. He runs the general store. Tell him I sent you, and he'll put you up for the night before you head back. No charge." Clay looked at the note, then at Dutch. The old man was giving him more than directions. He was giving him a lifeline, a bit of dignity in accepting help. Clay folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "Next to the telegram he'd picked up from Jake Thornton that morning. I appreciate it. Dutch, I'll pay you back when I can." "Just come back alive," Dutch said gruffly. "That's payment enough." The afternoon wore on, and Clay stayed by the stove, absorbing what warmth he could before the long ride ahead. A few other folks came and went. A trapper named Simon, who smelled of pine and wood smoke, a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who needed lamp oil, and a young ranch hand who bought tobacco and rope. Each of them had heard about Clay taking the telegram job, and each of them thought he was making a mistake, but none of them were down to their last dollar. None of them were facing a winter with no prospects and no safety net. Clay had learned the hard way that pride was expensive, and he couldn't afford it anymore. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Clay went out back to where he'd left his mule. Stubborn Sue was a 12-year-old Jenny he'd borrowed from a rancher in exchange for a week's labor. She was temperamental, prone to stopping dead in her tracks when she felt like it, and had an annoying habit of trying to bite Clay's shoulder when he saddled her. But she was sure-footed in snow and had endurance that would shame horses twice her size. "Just you and me again, girl," Clay said, running his hand down her neck. "One more job, and then maybe we can find something that doesn't involve freezing our tails off." Sue snorted and stamped her foot, which Clay took as agreement. He checked her shoes, made sure the saddle was secure, and loaded his bedroll and the small pack of supplies he'd assembled. Not much, some jerky, hardtack, a tin cup, and a wool blanket that had seen better days. The blanket had been Sarah's, one of the few things he'd kept after selling everything else. When he came back inside, Margaret had wrapped up more bread and some dried apples in a cloth. "For the road," she said firmly, pressing the bundle into his hands. "And you be careful. That pass can be treacherous even in good weather." "I will, ma'am." "Thank you." Dutch walked him to the door, and for a moment the old man just looked at him with an expression that reminded Clay of his father. "Clay, I've got work here if you want it," Dutch said quietly. "It's not glamorous, stocking shelves, cutting firewood, helping with deliveries. But it's steady, and it comes with a warm place to sleep and 3 meals a day. Margaret and I aren't getting any younger. We could use the help." Clay felt something catch in his throat. It was a generous offer, more generous than he deserved, and God knew he should take it. But something in him resisted the idea of settling, of accepting that this was as good as his life would get. He was still young enough to believe things might turn around, that he might find his way back to something resembling the life he'd lost. "I appreciate that, Dutch, I truly do. Let me think on it after I get back from Silverton." Dutch nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Doors open whenever you're ready." Clay shook the old man's hand, nodded to Margaret, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, sharp and unforgiving. Snow swirled in the lamplight from the trading post windows, and beyond that was nothing but darkness and the promise of a brutal night. He mounted Sue, and she shifted under him, unhappy about leaving the shelter of the barn. Clay couldn't blame her. Every instinct he had told him this was a bad idea, that $3 wasn't worth the risk, that he should turn around and accept Dutch's offer of work and warmth. But instead, he turned Sue's head toward the North Trail, toward Deadwood Pass, and the long climb up into the mountains. The telegram in his pocket felt like it weighed nothing at all, but the responsibility of it sat heavy on his shoulders. Jake Thornton was counting on him, and right now, being counted on felt important, even if it was just to deliver a message. The lights of the trading post faded behind him as Clay rode into the storm. The wind howled through the pines, and snow began to accumulate on his hat and shoulders. Sue plodded forward with her head down, following the trail more by instinct than sight. Clay pulled his collar up and tried not to think about how cold it would get once they reached the pass. Tried not to think about the warm stove and hot food back at Dutch's place. Tried not to think about all the bad decisions that had led him to this moment. Riding alone through a blizzard for $3. Instead, he thought about Sarah, about the way she used to worry when he was out working cattle in bad weather. She'd always made him promise to be careful, to come home safe. He'd kept that promise for the 10 years they were married, but he hadn't been able to keep her safe when it mattered most. The guilt of that still sat in his chest like a stone 5 years later. Maybe that's why he kept taking these foolish jobs, kept putting himself in situations where safety was a gamble. Maybe some part of him was still trying to make up for the one time he'd failed to protect what mattered most. Sue stumbled slightly, jarring Clay from his thoughts. He patted her neck and spoke soothingly, bringing his focus back to the present. The trail was getting harder to see as snow covered the ground, but he knew this country well enough to navigate by landmarks. That lightning-split pine, the boulder shaped like a bear's head, the creek crossing where ice would be forming over the current. They climbed steadily, and the temperature dropped with each 100 feet of elevation. Clay's fingers began to ache inside his gloves, and his breath made clouds in the darkness. But Sue kept moving, and that was enough. 1 foot in front of the other. 1 mile closer to Silverton, and the $3 waiting for him there. He figured it would take most of the night to reach the pass, and then another few hours down the other side to reach town. If the weather held and nothing went wrong, he'd arrive at first light, deliver the telegram, collect his pay, and rest at Dutch's cousin's store before making the return trip. It was a simple plan, a straightforward job. Nothing about it should have changed his life, but as Clay Jensen rode deeper into the blizzard, the father's knife solid in his pocket and nothing but determination keeping him upright, he had no way of knowing that he was less than 2 hours away from a decision that would define the rest of his days. The blizzard grew worse as Clay climbed higher into the pass. What had started as heavy snowfall had transformed into something meaner, something with teeth. The wind didn't just blow anymore, it attacked, coming in gusts that tried to knock Sue sideways and made Clay grip the saddle horn to keep his seat. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Clay could barely see Sue's ears, much less the trail ahead. He was navigating by feel now, trusting the mule's instincts and his own memory of the landscape. The pass should be another mile ahead, maybe less. Once they crested it, the descent toward Silverton would be sheltered from the worst of the wind. Sue suddenly stopped, her whole body going rigid. "Come on, girl," Clay said, nudging her flanks with his heels. "Not the time to be stubborn." But Sue didn't move. Her ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again. Clay had ridden this mule long enough to know her moods, and this wasn't stubbornness. This was alarm. He strained to hear anything over the howling wind. Nothing seemed out of place. Just the storm, the creak of snow-laden branches, the distant sound of the creek running somewhere to his left. But Sue was a range animal, with senses sharper than any human's. If she'd detected something, it was real. Clay squinted into the darkness, trying to penetrate the swirling snow. The trail here ran close to a line of pine trees, their branches bent under the weight of accumulated snow. Beyond them was rougher ground, all rocks and scrub that nobody bothered with because there was no reason to go there. Then Sue did something she'd never done before. She took 3 steps backward, snorting hard, her eyes rolling white. "Easy now," Clay said, his own alarm growing. He dismounted, partly to calm the mule and partly because his instincts were telling him something was wrong. He held Sue's reins tight and moved forward on foot, stepping carefully. That's when he saw it. Just a shadow at first, dark against the white snow, about 20 yards off the trail. The shape was wrong, too angular, too deliberate to be natural. Clay's hand went to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, but he didn't draw it yet. Whatever this was, it wasn't moving. He left Sue at the trail and pushed through the knee-deep snow toward the shape, his boots breaking through the frozen crust with each step. The cold bit through his pants, and wind-driven snow stung his face. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to get back on the mule and keep riding. He didn't have time for detours or mysteries. But 20 years of living in wild country had taught Clay that ignoring something unusual could be deadly. Better to investigate than to ride past and wonder. As he got closer, the shape resolved into something that made his stomach clench. 4 iron stakes, each about 2 feet tall, driven into the frozen ground in a rough rectangle. And between them, barely visible under a layer of snow, Clay broke into a stumbling run. It was a dog, a large German shepherd, bound spread-eagled to the 4 stakes with ropes so tight it had cut through the fur to skin. The animal was covered in snow, lying motionless, and for a horrible moment Clay thought he'd found a corpse. Then one eye opened, just a crack, just enough to meet Clay's gaze with a look that held no hope, only a kind of patient waiting for the end. "Jesus," Clay breathed, dropping to his knees beside the dog. His hands moved without conscious thought, brushing snow away, assessing the situation. The ropes were professional, good hemp, tied with knots that showed skill. The stakes were hand-forged iron, driven so deep that they barely moved when Clay tested them. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even casual cruelty. This was deliberate, calculated torture. The dog's coat was crusted with ice, especially around its muzzle, where breath had frozen. How long had it been here? Hours, certainly. Maybe since before the storm started. The animal's body temperature would be dangerously low, and those ropes had cut off circulation to the limbs. Even if Clay freed it now, the damage might be fatal, but that eye was still watching him, still holding onto some thread of life. Clay's fingers were already numb from the cold, but he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his father's knife. The bone handle felt solid and familiar in his hand. He'd used this knife for 1,000 ordinary tasks over the years, but never for something like this. Never to choose between letting something die or risking everything to save it. The wind shrieked through the pines above him, and snow pelted down harder. Clay thought about the telegram in his pocket, about the $3 waiting in Silverton, about the fact that he'd already lost too much time and the weather was getting worse by the minute. Then he thought about Sarah, about the way she'd never been able to walk past suffering without trying to help. She'd nursed injured birds, fed stray cats, cried over horses being mistreated. It had been one of the things he loved most about her, that capacity for compassion that never calculated the cost. "All right," Clay said quietly to the dog or to himself or maybe to Sarah's memory. "Let's get you out of this." He started with the front left paw, sawing through the rope with the knife blade. The hemp was thick and slightly frozen, making the work harder. His fingers screamed with cold, and he had to stop twice to blow on them for warmth. The rope finally parted with a pop, and the dog's leg fell slack. 3 more ropes. 3 more eternities of sawing, while his hands went from painful to numb, to a distant ache that frightened him more than the pain had. He could hear Sue snorting in alarm from the trail, could feel the storm intensifying around him, could sense the minutes ticking away. But he kept cutting. When the last rope parted, Clay tried to lift the dog. It was dead weight, easily 70 or 80 pounds, and his frozen hands struggled to get a grip. The dog's eyes had closed again, and Clay couldn't tell if it was unconscious or dying. He looked down at himself, at his wool coat, the only thing standing between him and hypothermia. Then he looked at the dog, its body temperature so low that it might not survive another 10 minutes exposed to this storm. Clay made his decision. He shrugged out of his coat, immediately feeling the cold slam into him like a physical blow. He wrapped the coat around the dog as best he could, bundling the animal's body against heat loss. Then he began the struggle to get the dog back to the trail. It took everything he had. The snow was deep, the weight was brutal, and without his coat, Clay's body began shutting down almost immediately. He stumbled twice, nearly dropping the dog both times. His breathing came in gasps that froze in his chest, and he couldn't feel his hands at all anymore. Sue backed away when he approached with the dog, her eyes rolling in fear or confusion. Clay had to spend precious seconds calming her, speaking in a voice that shook with cold and exertion. Finally, with more luck than skill, he managed to drape the dog across Sue's saddle. The telegram, Silverton, the $3. All of that was gone now, impossible. Even if Clay had been willing to leave the dog here, wrapped in his coat, he couldn't make the rest of the journey to Silverton without freezing to death himself. His only option was to turn back, to try to make it to the trading post before hypothermia took him. It was at least 2 hours back down the trail, maybe more in these conditions. Without his coat, Clay gave himself maybe half that time before his body temperature dropped too low to function. He put one hand on Sue's neck, steadying himself, and turned the mule back the way they'd come. The lights of Dutch McGraw's trading post seemed impossibly far away. The dog lay motionless across the saddle, wrapped in Clay's grey wool coat, while Clay stumbled alongside through the snow in just his shirt and vest. Every step was a battle. The wind cut through him like knives, and shivering racked his body so hard he could barely walk straight. His thoughts began to scatter, to drift. He found himself thinking about his father, about Sarah, about the ranch he'd lost, wondering if this was how it ended, frozen on a mountain trail because he couldn't walk past suffering. But his feet kept moving. One step, then another. Sue plodded forward, seeming to understand the urgency even without being told. The dog remained still, and Clay couldn't tell if he was carrying a dying animal or if there was still hope. The snow fell heavier. The wind howled louder, and Clay Jensen, who'd ridden out into the blizzard for $3 and a hot meal, stumbled through the darkness, carrying something far more valuable than he'd imagined. In the distance, barely visible through the storm, a light flickered. The trading post, still so far away, but there. A beacon in the darkness. Clay fixed his eyes on that light and kept walking. Clay didn't remember the last 100 yards. Later, Dutch would tell him that Sue had walked right up to the trading post door, with Clay barely conscious, one hand tangled in the mule's mane and the other clutching the dog-wrapped coat against the saddle. But Clay's memory of it was just fragments, the glow of lamplight, the sound of Dutch's voice raised in alarm, and the overwhelming warmth when someone pulled him through the doorway. He came back to himself, sitting on the floor in front of the pot-belly stove, shaking so violently his teeth were chattering together. Margaret McGraw had thrown 2 blankets around his shoulders and was forcing hot coffee into his hands, while Dutch knelt beside him, checking his extremities for frostbite. "You damned fool," Dutch was saying, but his voice was thick with emotion. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Clay tried to answer but couldn't make his jaw work properly. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, distant and unreliable. Sensation was starting to return to his hands and feet, bringing with it pain that made him gasp. "The dog," Clay finally managed to say. "Is the dog alive barely?" Margaret said, pressing the coffee cup more firmly into Clay's shaking hands. "Simon and Bill are with him now. Drink this." All of it. Through the fog in his head, Clay realized there were other people in the trading post. The trapper Simon and Bill Patterson, a local rancher, stood near the back wall where they'd laid the dog on a pile of blankets. "The animal wasn't moving. Found him staked out," Clay said, forcing the words through chattering teeth. "Someone tied him there." "Left him to freeze." Dutch's face darkened, but he didn't stop his examination of Clay's fingers and toes. "Can you feel this?" He pressed on Clay's left foot. "Yes. Hurts. Good. That's good. Means no serious frostbite, just the beginning stages." Dutch looked up at Margaret. "Get him out of those wet clothes. And bring more blankets. For the next hour, Clay existed in a haze of being tended to. They stripped him of his soaked shirt and pants, wrapped him in dry blankets, and kept pouring hot liquids into him. Coffee, then broth, then more coffee. Gradually, the violent shaking subsided to occasional tremors, and feeling returned fully to his extremities. His hands and feet throbbed with a deep ache, but Dutch said that was normal, that he'd be all right. But even as his own condition improved, Clay's attention kept returning to the dog. Simon and Margaret were working on the animal now, and the scene wasn't encouraging. The dog lay motionless, except for shallow, irregular breathing. His fur was matted with ice, and what looked like blood in several places. The ropes had left raw wounds on all four legs. "He's in bad shape," Simon said quietly, running experienced hands over the dog's body. "Hypothermia for sure. These wounds are infected. See how the skin's inflamed? And look here." He indicated the dog's ribs. "Burns, old ones, maybe a week or two. Someone's been working on this animal for a while." Bill Patterson, a heavy-set man with a perpetually red face, shook his head. "This is deliberate torture. I've seen rough treatment of animals before, but this is different. This is calculated. Who would do such a thing?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with anger. "Someone who enjoys causing pain," Simon said. "Someone sick in the head." Clay managed to stand, though his legs felt like water. He moved closer to where the dog lay, looking down at the animal's face. Even unconscious and near death, there was something noble about the dog's features. This was a well-bred animal, possibly trained for some purpose. The shape of his head, the size of his paws, this wasn't some random stray. He belonged to someone, Clay said. "Look at him. That's a working dog, probably expensive. Someone invested time and money in training him, which makes this even worse," Dutch said, coming to stand beside Clay. "Means whoever did this specifically targeted a valuable animal, wanted to destroy something precious." The dog's eye opened slightly. That same look Clay had seen on the trail, awareness without hope. But then the eye focused on Clay's face, and something shifted in the animal's expression. Recognition, maybe, or gratitude. "We need to keep him warm and hydrated," Margaret said, always practical. "If he makes it through the night, he might have a chance." Simon helped me move him closer to the stove. They repositioned the dog's makeshift bed nearer to the heat source. Margaret brought clean cloths and warm water, carefully cleaning the wounds and infected areas. The dog flinched, but didn't resist, too weak to do more than accept the treatment. "This is going to cost you that telegram delivery money," Bill said to Clay, not unkindly. "Dog this size needs food, needs medicine for those infections. You going to be able to handle that?" Clay looked at Bill, then at the dog, then at his own hands still trembling slightly from the cold. $3. That's what he'd been willing to risk his life for. Now he'd spent that $3 and then some on a dog that might not survive the night. "I'll handle it," Clay said. "How?" Bill pressed. "You told me yourself 2 days ago you were broke. I said I'll handle it." Clay's voice came out harder than he intended. Dutch cleared his throat. "That offer I made you earlier still stands. Work here at the trading post, room and board included. Margaret and I can use the help, and it means you'll be around to tend to the dog while he heals. If he heals." Clay met Dutch's eyes and saw no pity there, just straightforward pragmatism. The old man was giving him a way to maintain his dignity while accepting help. After what he'd just done, risking his own life in a blizzard to save a tortured animal, nobody in this room thought less of him. "I accept," Clay said, "and I'm grateful." "Good. That's settled then." Dutch turned to the others. "Simon, you're the best tracker we have. Come first light, I want you to go back up that trail with Clay. Find where this dog was staked out and see if there's any sign of who did it." Simon nodded. "Be happy to. Something like this can't go unanswered." They spent the rest of the night in shifts, someone always awake to watch the dog and keep the stove fed. Clay refused to sleep despite his exhaustion, sitting beside the animal and watching the shallow rise and fall of its chest. Around 3 in the morning, Margaret brought him a plate of food and sat down beside him. "You're a good man, Clay Jensen," she said softly. "Sarah would be proud of what you did tonight." Clay felt something catch in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear his wife's name. Hadn't expected the wave of emotion that came with it. She always said I had more heart than sense, he managed. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Margaret patted his shoulder and stood. Dog still breathing. That's something. That's more than he had a few hours ago. As dawn approached, the dog's breathing seemed to strengthen slightly. When the first grey light touched the windows, his eyes opened and stayed open. Clay moved closer, speaking in a low, calm voice. You're all right now. You're safe. The dog watched him, and for the first time Clay saw something other than resignation in those eyes. Not trust yet, that would take time, but maybe the beginning of understanding that not all humans meant harm. We're going to figure out who did this to you, Clay promised. And we're going to make sure they never do it to another living thing. The dog's tail moved slightly, the smallest acknowledgement. It was enough. Clay settled in for the long work of recovery, knowing that saving this animal's life was only the first step. Justice, real justice, would require more. And somehow, looking into those intelligent eyes, Clay knew this dog would be part of that reckoning. 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. The dog survived the first night, then the second, clinging to life with a stubbornness that Clay found himself admiring. By the third morning, the animal was able to lift his head and take water without assistance. And the worst of the infections seemed to be responding to the poultices Margaret applied twice daily. Clay threw himself into the work at the trading post with a focus he hadn't felt in years. He stocked shelves, split firewood until his back ached, helped Dutch with inventory, and cleaned every corner of the building that Margaret pointed to. But every spare moment found him beside the dog, talking quietly, checking wounds, offering small bits of food. You're going to wear yourself out, Dutch observed on the afternoon of the third day, watching Clay hand-feed the dog pieces of cooked venison. Dog's doing better. You could take a rest. Don't feel tired, Clay said, though that wasn't entirely true. He was exhausted, running on coffee and determination, but stopping felt wrong somehow. Like if he stopped moving, he'd have to think about the larger questions. What came next? What kind of future he was building? Whether any of it mattered. The dog took the venison gently from Clay's fingers, chewing carefully. His strength was definitely returning. Earlier that morning, he'd managed to stand for a few seconds before his legs gave out. Progress. He's trained, Clay said, not for the first time. Watch how he takes food. That's discipline. Someone spent months teaching him proper behavior. Military, maybe? Dutch suggested. Or law enforcement. Could be. He's got the build for it. And the temperament. See how alert he is even now. He's watching everyone who comes near, assessing threats. Clay ran his hand gently down the dog's back, feeling the prominent ribs. But no collar, no identification marks. Whoever owned him either removed those things, or they were taken. Simon came in from outside, stomping snow from his boots. The trapper had gone back up the trail that first morning as promised, but found nothing useful. The storm had covered any tracks, and the stakes themselves told no story beyond their brutal purpose. Hearing things from town, Simon said, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret. Talked to a ranch hand from the Broken Arrow spread. They lost 3 head of cattle last week, found them mutilated in the north pasture. Wolves. Dutch asked. That's what they thought at first. But the wounds weren't right. Too calculated, too deliberate. And there were burn marks on one of the animals. Someone with a branding iron or something similar. Simon looked down at the dog. Same kind of burns our friend here has on his ribs. The room went quiet. Clay felt anger rising in his chest, a cold fury that had been building since he'd first found the dog staked out to die. So, we've got someone in the area who enjoys torturing animals, Bill Patterson said. He'd become a regular visitor over the past few days, checking on the dog's progress. Question is, what do we do about it? Report it to the sheriff when he comes through next, Dutch said. That's the proper way to handle it. Sheriff won't be through for another 2 weeks, Bill countered. By then, whoever's doing this could be long gone. Or could have hurt more animals. Or worse, Simon said quietly. Men who torture animals for pleasure don't usually stop there. I've seen it before. They escalate. Clay had heard similar things from his father, who'd once tracked down a drifter who'd been killing dogs around their ranch. The man had eventually graduated to attacking a woman traveling alone. His father had found her in time, barely, and made sure the drifter faced justice. But the experience had taught Clay that certain kinds of evil didn't contain themselves. They grew. The dog shifted, trying to get more comfortable, and Clay adjusted the blankets around him. The animal's eyes met his, and Clay saw intelligence there and something else. A kind of shared understanding, perhaps. Both of them had been broken by circumstances beyond their control. Both of them were fighting to recover. "We need to name him," Margaret said, changing the subject with the intuition that comes from decades of managing difficult conversations. "Can't keep calling him the dog." "Justice," Clay said immediately. The word had been in his mind since that first night, though he hadn't spoken it aloud until now. "His name should be Justice," Margaret smiled. "That's fitting. Justice it is, then." "Justice," Clay repeated, and the dog's ears perked up slightly. Whether he recognized the word or just responded to Clay's tone, it was hard to say. But something in the animal's bearing suggested approval. Over the next few days, Justice's recovery accelerated. He began eating regular meals, standing for longer periods, even taking a few careful steps around the trading post. The wounds on his legs healed clean, though they'd leave permanent scars. The burns on his ribs would mark him for life. But the physical damage wasn't what worried Clay most. It was the psychological trauma. Justice flinched at sudden movements. He showed fear response to raised voices, even friendly ones. And at night, he had what could only be nightmares, whimpering and twitching in his sleep until Clay woke him gently. Whatever this dog had endured went beyond the injuries they could see. "He'll need time," Margaret said, watching Justice carefully navigate around the stove. "Healing the body is one thing. Healing the spirit takes longer." Clay understood that better than most. 5 years after losing Sarah, he still had days where grief hit him like a physical blow. Still had moments where he wondered if he'd ever feel whole again. Time helped, but it didn't erase. It just taught you how to carry the weight. On the 5th day, Justice demonstrated something remarkable. Clay had been working outside, splitting firewood in the cold afternoon air, when he heard barking from inside the trading post. He dropped the axe and ran, thinking something was wrong, but when he burst through the door, he found Justice standing at full height, hackles raised, positioned between Margaret and a stranger who'd just entered. The dog wasn't attacking, but his message was clear. He was protecting someone he'd adopted as part of his pack. The stranger, a traveling merchant, raised his hands in surprise. "Easy there, friend. Just looking to buy some supplies." "Justice down," Clay said firmly, and the dog immediately sat, though he remained alert and watchful. The obedience was instant, ingrained. This was definitely a trained animal, responding to commands with military precision. After the merchant completed his business and left, Dutch looked at Clay with raised eyebrows. "That dog knows his work, and he's chosen you as his person, seems like." Clay knelt beside Justice, running his hands over the dog's head and ears. The animal leaned into the touch, finally allowing himself to relax. In that moment, something shifted between them. This wasn't just about rescuing an animal anymore. This was about two broken things, finding a way to be whole together. "We're going to figure out who hurt you," Clay promised quietly. "Not for revenge, for justice, real justice. So they can't hurt anyone else." Justice looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and Clay could have sworn the dog understood every word. More than that, he approved. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Outside, snow continued to fall over Deadwood Pass, covering the mountains in white silence. And somewhere in that wilderness, the person who tortured Justice remained free, unknown, and dangerous. But the dog was healing, getting stronger every day. And Clay Jensen, who'd been drifting without purpose for 5 years, suddenly had a reason to move forward. Sometimes salvation comes when you stop looking for it, when you simply choose to do the right thing, even when it costs everything, and trust that meaning will follow. Clay had learned that lesson on a frozen trail, cutting ropes in a blizzard. And now, watching Justice rest peacefully by the stove, he understood that some rescues work both ways. Sheriff William Cole arrived at the trading post on a grey morning exactly 1 week after Clay had found justice. The lawman was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much but hadn't lost their sharpness. He rode a sturdy bay horse and carried himself with the quiet authority that came from 30 years of enforcing law in hard country. Clay was outside chopping wood when the sheriff dismounted. Justice, who'd been lying nearby in a patch of weak sunlight, immediately stood and moved to Clay's side, watching the stranger with keen attention. "That's quite a dog you've got there," Cole said, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Not threatening, just careful. German Shepherd, looks like. Well-trained, too, by his posture. He's recovering from some rough treatment," Clay said, setting down the axe. "I'm Clay Jensen. This is Justice. William Cole, County Sheriff." He studied Justice more closely, and something in his expression shifted. "Mind if I take a closer look at him?" Clay nodded, and Cole approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. Justice remained alert but didn't show aggression. The sheriff knelt down, examining the dog from several angles, paying particular attention to the scarring on his legs and ribs. "Where'd you find him?" Cole asked, his voice suddenly tense. "Staked out in the snow up near Deadwood Pass, about a week back. Someone had tied him to iron stakes and left him to freeze. He was nearly dead when I found him." Cole stood up, his jaw tight. "4 stakes?" "Rope tied to all 4 legs, spread out so he couldn't move." "That's right. How did you—" "Because that's the signature of the man I'm hunting." Cole's hand moved to his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a wanted poster. "This is Silas Blackwood. Wanted for the murder of at least 3 people, though I suspect the real count is higher. And he's known for something else." Cole's voice went cold. "He tortures animals. It's his calling card. Always uses the same method. Stakes in the ground, specific knots, leaves them to suffer." Clay took the poster, studying the face printed there. Blackwood looked to be in his 40s, with a lean face, dark hair, and eyes that even in the rough illustration seemed cold and empty. The list of crimes took up most of the page: murder, robbery, assault. But it was the note at the bottom that made Clay's blood run cold. "Extremely dangerous. Known to torture animals before and after violent crimes. Do not approach alone." "He's in this area?" Clay asked. "He's been operating throughout the Wyoming Territory for the past year, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for us to catch him. But about 3 weeks ago he made a mistake." Cole's voice dropped. "He murdered a U.S. Marshal named Thomas Grant. Tom was tracking him through these mountains, got close enough that Blackwood felt threatened. They had a confrontation near a creek somewhere in the high country. Justice had gone rigid at Cole's side, a low whine building in his throat. The dog's reaction was so pronounced that both men noticed immediately. Tom Grant had a tracking dog," Cole continued, watching Justice carefully. "A German Shepherd he'd worked with for 5 years. Best tracker in the territory, Tom used to say. After the murder, we found Tom's body but never found the dog. We assumed Blackwood killed it too, but couldn't locate the remains." Cole looked directly at Justice. "This is Tom Grant's dog, isn't it?" "I think so," Clay said quietly. "The training, the way he responds to commands, this is a law enforcement animal." Cole knelt down again, and this time his hands were gentle as they moved over Justice's scars. "Tom was my friend. We went through training together 25 years ago. He was one of the best lawmen I ever knew, and he loved this dog like family." The sheriff's voice thickened with emotion. "If Blackwood kept him alive just to torture him, left him staked out to die slowly, that's exactly the kind of calculated cruelty I'd expect from him." "Why does he do it?" Clay asked. "The animal torture. What's the purpose?" "Control, power, fear." Cole stood, his face hardening into professional detachment. "I've studied men like Blackwood. They enjoy causing suffering, but they also use it as a tool. Killing animals in an area makes people nervous, makes them scared. Fear makes people talk less, cooperate less. And for Blackwood, the torture itself is part of the thrill. He's not just a murderer, he's a sadist." Justice had begun pacing, his agitation clear. Every mention of Grant, every detail Cole shared, seemed to affect the dog deeply. Clay moved to his side, running a hand along Justice's back, trying to provide comfort. "The trail went cold after we found Tom's body," Cole said, pulling out a small notebook. "But in the past 2 weeks there have been incidents. Livestock killed and mutilated at the Broken Arrow Ranch. A trapline vandalized and the animals tortured before death. And 3 days ago, a homesteader reported finding stakes in the ground behind his barn. No animal attached, but the message was clear." He marked locations on a rough map in his notebook. "He's still in the area, and he's getting bolder. Why hasn't he moved on?" Clay asked. "You said he usually keeps moving. That's what troubles me. Blackwood's pattern is to commit crimes and leave before law enforcement can coordinate a response. But he's been in this region for nearly a month now. Either he's found something here worth staying for, or—" Cole paused, considering. "Or what? Or he's waiting for something. Or someone." The sheriff looked at Justice. "He knows Tom Grant's dog survived. Maybe he wants to finish what he started. Or maybe he's just arrogant enough to think he can operate here indefinitely without being caught." Clay felt anger building in his chest, the cold fury he'd been carrying since finding Justice. "So what do we do? Wait for him to kill someone else? I've got deputies coming in from 2 neighboring counties. Should be here within the week. We'll organize a proper manhunt, track him down systematically." Cole's voice was steady, professional. "In the meantime, people need to be warned. I'm visiting every ranch, every homestead, every trading post in the region. Blackwood is dangerous, and nobody should travel alone or leave their property vulnerable. And if we find him before your deputies arrive—" Cole met Clay's eyes with a look that was part warning, part understanding. "Then you send someone to fetch me immediately. Blackwood is a trained army scout, excellent tracker, expert marksman. He knows this country, and he's killed better men than most in a fair fight. Don't try to be a hero, Mr. Jensen. I've already lost one good friend to this man. I don't need to lose anyone else." Clay nodded, but his hand rested on Justice's head, feeling the tension in the dog's body. This animal had witnessed his master's murder, had been tortured by the killer and left to die in the snow. Justice had survived against impossible odds. And now, hearing about Blackwood, the dog's entire demeanor had changed. There was purpose in his bearing now, a focused intensity that spoke of unfinished business. "What will happen to Justice?" Clay asked. "If we catch Blackwood, I mean. Does he belong to Marshal Grant's family?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Tom's widow lives in Denver with their daughter. I'll need to contact her, tell her we found the dog alive. She should make that decision." He looked at Justice, then at Clay. "But I can tell this dog has chosen you. And given what you did to save him, I think Tom would approve of that. He always said good dogs knew good men." After the sheriff rode off to continue his rounds, Clay stood in the cold morning air with Justice pressed against his leg. Inside the trading post, Dutch and Margaret were hearing the news, and Clay could see their reactions through the window. Fear, yes, but also determination. People in this country didn't take kindly to threats, especially threats against the innocent. "He's still out there," Clay said to Justice. "The man who hurt you. The man who killed your partner." Justice looked up at him, and in those eyes, Clay saw something he recognized from his own reflection, the need for resolution, for closure, for justice that meant more than revenge. They'd both been broken by violence and loss. They'd both survived. And now, somehow, they'd both found a purpose. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow and pine from the mountains. Somewhere up there, Silas Blackwood was hiding, planning, waiting. But he didn't know that the dog he'd tortured had survived. Didn't know that animal was healing, getting stronger, remembering. Clay put his hand on Justice's head, feeling the solid warmth of the dog beneath his palm. "We'll be ready," he promised. "When the time comes, we'll be ready." And deep in his bones, Clay knew that time was coming soon. The night after Sheriff Cole's visit, Justice couldn't settle. Clay woke several times to find the dog pacing near the door of the small room behind the trading post, where they both slept now. Each time, Clay would speak softly, coax Justice back to his blankets, and the dog would lie down. But the restlessness remained, a barely contained energy that seemed to build with each passing hour. By morning, Justice's behavior had intensified. He refused breakfast, something he hadn't done since the first days of his recovery. Instead, he stationed himself by the front door, whining low in his throat, occasionally pawing at the wooden frame. "He knows something," Dutch observed, watching the dog from behind the counter. "Animals can sense things we can't. Weather changes, danger, sometimes even intent." Clay had seen similar behavior in cattle before thunderstorms, in horses before earthquakes. But this felt different. Justice wasn't displaying general anxiety. He was focused, directed. His attention kept pulling toward the northwest, toward the high peaks and deep valleys where Marshal Grant had died. "He wants to track," Clay said, the realization settling over him like cold water. "He's picking up something in the air, some scent that's telling him Blackwood is close. Or he's just remembering," Margaret suggested gently. "Trauma can do strange things to the mind, make old fears resurface." Maybe the sheriff's visit triggered memories he'd been suppressing, but Clay didn't think so. He'd watched Justice heal over the past week, seen the dog's intelligence and training reassert themselves. This wasn't fear or confusion. This was purpose. Around mid-morning, a local rancher named Ed Patterson, Bill's brother, arrived at the trading post with news. 3 of his horses had been found dead that morning in his north pasture, about 10 miles up the valley. The animals hadn't just been killed. They'd been mutilated, branded with burns, and arranged in a specific pattern, same as the cattle at Broken Arrow, Ed said, his voice tight with anger. But worse somehow, more deliberate, and he left a message carved into one of my fence posts. Ed pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. "Drew this copy of it. Didn't want to leave the original." He unfolded the paper to reveal crude lettering carved into wood. "Marshall's dog died slow." The room went silent. Justice, who'd been lying near the stove, suddenly stood. His hackles raised and a low growl built in his chest, the first truly aggressive sound Clay had heard from him since the rescue. "He knows you found the dog," Dutch said quietly. "Somehow Blackwood knows Justice survived, and he's taunting you with it." Clay felt ice in his veins. "When did you find this?" "At first light, maybe 2 hours ago. Came straight here to warn folks and see if we could get word to the sheriff. But Ed Patterson lives alone, 10 miles from the nearest neighbor, and he had to ride carefully in case Blackwood was watching, which means Blackwood was on your property sometime in the past 24 hours, Clay said. And he took the time to kill your horses, mutilate them, and carve that message. That's not someone in a hurry to leave. That's someone who feels safe, who thinks he's in control." Justice had moved to the door, his entire body rigid with attention. He looked back at Clay with an expression that was unmistakable. Readiness. The dog wanted to hunt. Simon the trapper had come in during the conversation. "I can track," he said. "Been doing it my whole life. If Blackwood's leaving bodies and messages, he's leaving trail. We could find him. Sheriff said to wait for his deputies," Dutch reminded them. "Said Blackwood's dangerous, trained military expert shot. Sheriff also said he's tortured and murdered at least 3 people that we know of," Clay counted. "How many more while we wait? Ed's horses today. What tomorrow? And the message, he's playing games, getting bold. He wants someone to come after him. Then we'd be walking into exactly the trap he's set," Dutch said. "That's not courage, Clay. That's foolishness." But Clay was watching Justice, seeing the way the dog moved, the precision in his stance. This wasn't just an animal recovering from trauma. This was a trained law enforcement officer, a tracker who'd spent 5 years hunting criminals with Marshal Grant. And right now, that dog was locked onto something none of them could perceive. What if we don't engage? Clay said slowly, the plan forming as he spoke. "What if we just track? Justice can find him, I'm sure of it. Relocate where he's hiding, mark the position and send for the sheriff. We don't confront Blackwood ourselves. We just give Cole the information he needs to make the arrest with his deputies." Simon considered this, then nodded. "That could work. Justice leads, I track sign, you handle the dog. We stay well back, observe only." "It's still dangerous," Margaret said. "What if Blackwood sees you? What if he's set traps or ambushes?" "Then we back off and run," Clay said. "But we can't just do nothing. Ed's place is 10 miles out. That's 10 miles closer to here than Blackwood was yesterday. He's moving this direction, and I don't think that's coincidence. The sheriff was here yesterday. Maybe someone told Blackwood a lawman came through, and he's interested. Dutch rubbed his beard, thinking. I don't like it. But I also don't like waiting around for a killer to pick his next victim. If you're going to do this, you take rifles. You take extra ammunition. And you promise me, that at the first sign of real danger, you turn back. I promise, Clay said. They spent an hour preparing. Clay borrowed Dutch's Winchester rifle and a good knife. Simon checked his own weapons and packed tracking supplies. Margaret prepared food and water, her face tight with worry, but her hands steady with purpose. Ed Patterson offered to ride to the county seat and bring back the sheriff, which would take at least 6 hours. Tell Cole we're tracking only, Clay said. Tell him we'll leave trail markers so he can follow. But we're not engaging the target. Justice seemed to understand they were preparing for a hunt. His agitation transformed into focused calm, the professional demeanor of a working dog. When Clay attached a length of rope as a makeshift lead, Justice accepted it without resistance, though Clay suspected he wouldn't really need it. The dog knew his job. They set out at noon, following Justice's lead toward the northwest. The dog moved with purpose, his nose working the air, occasionally dropping to check scent on the ground. Simon followed, reading sign that Clay couldn't see, disturbed snow, broken branches, the subtle indications that someone had passed this way recently. The trail led them away from established paths, into rougher country where rocks and steep terrain made travel difficult. But Justice navigated it easily, and Clay found himself trusting the dog's instincts completely. This was what Justice had been trained for, tracking fugitives through wilderness, finding people who didn't want to be found. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. They passed Ed Patterson's ranch, saw the dead horses he'd described, and Clay felt his anger rise again at the senseless cruelty. Justice paused there, circling the area, then picked up a trail leading northeast from the scene. He's heading toward the old mining territory, Simon said quietly. There's a dozen abandoned camps up there, caves, places to hide. If Blackwood's smart, and the sheriff says he is, he's probably holed up in one of those locations. They moved carefully, and Justice led them higher into the mountains. The trail was hours old, but still clear to the dog's superior senses. Clay watched Justice work and felt a deep respect for the animal's skill and determination. This dog had been tortured by Blackwood, left to die, and yet here he was, hunting his tormentor with professional precision. No fear, no hesitation, just purpose. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Justice suddenly went rigid. His head came up, nostrils flaring, and every line of his body signaled alert. Clay and Simon dropped low instinctively, scanning the terrain ahead. Smoke, faint but present, carried on the wind from somewhere ahead and slightly uphill. Someone had a fire burning, probably trying to stay warm. And Justice's reaction suggested he knew exactly whose fire it was. Clay felt his heart hammering. They'd found him. After just half a day of tracking, Justice had led them to Silas Blackwood's location. Now came the hard part, observing without being seen, marking the position, and getting back to alert the sheriff. But as Clay looked at Justice, saw the intensity in the dog's eyes, he wondered if the animal would be willing to turn back now. They were close to the man who'd murdered Marshal Grant, who'd tortured Justice and left him to freeze. Every instinct the dog had was probably screaming to finish the hunt, to bring the fugitive to justice. Easy, boy, Clay whispered, his hand gentle on Justice's neck. We found him. Now we wait for the law. Justice looked back at Clay, and in that moment man and dog understood each other perfectly. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The real kind. The kind that required patience, planning, and the rule of law. But it was also about making sure evil didn't escape unpunished. And as they settled in to watch, to mark the location and prepare to retreat, all three of them, Clay, Simon, and Justice, knew that the final confrontation was coming soon. They waited in the cold, watching smoke rise from somewhere beyond the next ridge. Simon marked their position carefully, noting landmarks and the direction of the smoke source. The plan was simple: observe for an hour, confirm the location, then retreat and send for the sheriff. Safe, smart, professional, but Justice had other ideas. The dog's agitation grew as they watched. He paced in tight circles, whined low in his throat, and kept pulling against the rope led toward the smoke. Clay held firm, speaking in soothing tones, but he could feel Justice's determination like a physical force. "Something's wrong," Simon whispered. "Dog's acting like there's more here than just a campsite." Clay was beginning to think the same thing. Justice wasn't displaying simple prey drive or aggression. This was something more specific, more urgent. The dog kept moving northeast, not directly toward the smoke, but at an angle to it, as if something else was pulling his attention. "Let him go," Simon said suddenly. "Not toward the smoke. See how he's pulling. He's trying to lead us somewhere else. Something he needs to show us." Clay hesitated, weighing risks. But Justice's insistence was so pronounced, so focused, that overriding it felt wrong. This dog had been Tom Grant's partner for 5 years. If he was trying to communicate something important, it deserved consideration. "All right," Clay said quietly, loosening his grip on the rope. "Show us, boy, but quiet. Stay low and quiet." Justice moved immediately, keeping to cover, his body low to the ground. Clay and Simon followed, rifles ready, every sense alert for danger. The dog led them along a game trail that ran parallel to the ridge, staying below the sightline of whoever had made that fire. After about a quarter mile, Justice stopped at a frozen creek bed, partially concealed by snow-laden evergreens. The area was unremarkable at first glance, just another stretch of wilderness. But Justice began digging at a specific spot, his paws working frantically at the snow and frozen earth. Clay knelt beside him, helping clear the snow. His fingers, protected by gloves, still ached with cold. The ground beneath was hard as iron, and whatever Justice wanted them to find was buried deep. But the dog's determination was absolute, and Clay found himself trusting that instinct. Then his gloved hand struck something that wasn't earth or stone, something metal. He dug more carefully, and slowly a shape emerged from the frozen ground. A badge, a U.S. Marshal's star, bent and discolored but unmistakable. Clay lifted it from the snow and ice, holding it in his palm like a sacred relic. "God," Simon breathed. "This is where Grant died." Justice had moved a few feet away and was digging at another spot, even more frantically than before. Clay and Simon joined him, and this time they found something wrapped in what looked like oilskin, a protective covering that trappers used to keep things dry. Clay worked it free from the frozen earth, his heart pounding. Inside the oilskin was a leather-bound journal. Clay opened it carefully, aware that he was holding evidence of a murder, possibly a dead man's last words. The pages were protected from weather damage, the ink still clear and readable. And there, on the first page in careful handwriting, "Property of Thomas Grant, U.S. Marshal, Wyoming Territory." "We should stop," Simon said. "This is evidence. Sheriff needs to see it untouched." But Clay was already reading the final entries, unable to stop himself. The journal was full of tracking notes, observations about Silas Blackwood's patterns and movements. Grant had been methodical, professional, building a case, entry by entry. But it was the last few pages that made Clay's breath catch. November 28, 1891. Have tracked subject to the vicinity of Deadwood Pass. Believe he has established a base camp in the old mining territory. Subject continues pattern of animal torture before human crimes. 3 incidents this week alone. Must stop him before he escalates to another murder. November 29th, 1891. Justice picked up strong scent trail leading toward Widow's Peak area. My partner's tracking skills remain exceptional. 5 years together, and I've never worked with a better dog. If something happens to me, Justice knows the truth. He's witnessed Blackwood's cruelty firsthand. Saw him torture that rancher's dog 2 days ago. Justice wanted to attack, but I held him back. Evidence first, justice second. November 30th, 1891. Located what I believe is Blackwood's camp. Preparing to approach under cover of darkness. If successful, this case ends tonight. If not, If I've misjudged his awareness or his willingness to fight, then I want it known that Blackwood is more dangerous than the reports suggest. He's intelligent, calculating, and absolutely without mercy. Justice stays close. Good dog. Best partner I've ever had. Sarah and Emily will take care of him if the entry ended there. No signature, no completion. Just the final thoughts of a man who knew he might not survive the night. Clay looked up at Simon, then down at Justice, who sat watching them with those knowing eyes. He was writing this the day he died. He knew the risk, and the dog was with him, Simon said softly. Justice saw everything. Saw Blackwood murder his partner, probably saw him conceal the body, and then he trailed off, looking at the scarred, healed wounds on Justice's legs and ribs. Then Blackwood kept Justice alive to torture him. As revenge, maybe, or as a sick trophy. Clay felt rage building in his chest, colder and more focused than any anger he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. This was about Marshal Thomas Grant, a good man who died doing his duty. A man who trusted his dog, his partner, and had that trust honored even after death. He flipped back through the journal, reading more. Grant's entries painted a picture of a dedicated lawman with a family waiting for him in Denver. A wife named Sarah, the same name as Clay's late wife, and a daughter, Emily, who was 7 years old. There were small notes about missing them, about looking forward to going home after this case was closed, but he'd never made it home. Blackwood had seen to that. There's more here, Simon said, having searched the immediate area. He'd found disturbed earth, partially concealed by snow and fallen branches. Grave, looks like. Shallow, hidden. Blackwood would have buried Grant quick and moved on. They spent another 20 minutes carefully documenting everything, making sure they could lead the sheriff back to this exact spot. The journal went back in its oilskin covering. The badge was wrapped carefully, and they marked the location with specific landmarks that Simon could reproduce on a map. Justice stood guard over the area, his posture protective. This was his partner's resting place, the spot where everything had changed. The dog had survived Blackwood's torture, had dragged himself away after being staked out, and had somehow made it to the trail where Clay found him. It was a miracle of survival, driven by pure determination. Justice brought us here, Clay said, the realization settling over him like a weight. Not to the smoke, not to Blackwood's camp. He brought us here first, to Grant, to the evidence, because that's what he was trained to do. Secure the evidence. Simon nodded slowly. Even traumatized, even half dead, the training held. He couldn't help Grant anymore, but he could make sure the truth came out. Clay knelt beside Justice, his hand gentle on the dog's head. You're not just a survivor. You're a witness, and you've been trying to bring us here since you recovered enough to move. Justice leaned into Clay's touch, and for the first time since the rescue, Clay saw something like peace in the dog's eyes. Not closure. That would only come when Blackwood was caught. But acknowledgement. Someone finally understood what had happened, what Justice had endured and survived. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, and they needed to make decisions. The smoke from Blackwood's fire was still visible in the distance. They'd found what Justice wanted them to find, and now they had a choice. Turn back, report to the sheriff, let proper law enforcement handle it. That was the smart play, the safe play. But both men were looking at Justice, seeing the tension in the dog's body, the way his attention kept drifting toward that distant smoke. Blackwood was close. The man who'd murdered Grant, who'd tortured Justice, who'd killed innocent animals and left messages carved in fence posts. He was right there, less than a mile away. We should go back, Simon said, but his voice lacked conviction. We should, Clay agreed. But neither of them moved. Justice made the decision for them. The dog stood, looked at both men with an expression that was almost human in its clarity, and then started moving toward the smoke. Not running, not charging, just walking with purpose, with the absolute certainty of a trained officer who knew his duty. Clay grabbed the rope lead, but Justice was already ahead of him. And somehow, some way, Clay knew this was right. Grant's journal had said it. If something happens to me, Justice knows the truth. The dog had been trying to tell them. had been working toward this moment since he'd recovered enough to stand. "We're not engaging," Clay said firmly, following Justice. "We're tracking only. If we spot Blackwood, we pull back and get the sheriff. But if Justice can lead us to where he's hiding, to solid evidence of his location, then the sheriff can bring his deputies and end this properly." Simon checked his rifle and fell in beside them. "Tracking only. I'm holding you to that promise." They moved carefully through the trees, following Justice's lead. The dog was different now, not agitated, not anxious. He moved with the smooth confidence of a professional doing his job. Every few yards he'd stop, test the air, check his surroundings, then continue forward. It was beautiful to watch, this display of training and instinct working together. The smoke grew closer, more distinct, and as they crested a small rise, Clay spotted it through the trees. A stone and timber cabin, one of the old mining structures from the silver boom days. It was in better repair than most, with smoke rising steadily from a stone chimney. A single horse stood in a rough shelter beside the structure, confirming someone was home. Justice went completely still, every muscle locked. His eyes fixed on that cabin with laser focus. And in that moment, Clay understood. This wasn't just where Blackwood was hiding. This was where Grant had died. This was where Justice had witnessed his partner's murder. The dog trembled slightly, but not with fear. With anticipation, with the need for completion, for justice. The right kind of justice. The legal, proper kind that would honor Grant's memory and ensure Blackwood never hurt anyone again. "We've got him," Simon whispered. "We know where he is. Now we go get the sheriff." Clay nodded, his hand firm on Justice's collar. They'd found what they came for. Found Grant's evidence, found Blackwood's hideout, found the truth. Now they just had to turn around and let the proper authorities handle it. But as Clay began to back away, Justice suddenly tensed. A door opened on the cabin and a figure emerged, lean, dark-haired, exactly matching the description from the wanted poster. Silas Blackwood stepped out into the fading daylight, stretching, completely unaware he was being watched. And Justice, despite all his training, despite Clay's hand on his collar, let out a low, barely audible growl that carried everything he'd endured. Recognition, hatred, justice. Clay's hand clamped over Justice's muzzle, cutting off the growl before it could carry. His heart hammered as Blackwood stood there, maybe 150 yards away, scanning the tree line with the casual wariness of a man who'd lived by his instincts for years. Long seconds passed. Blackwood's eyes swept the area where they were hidden, paused, then moved on. He was looking for threats, but not with any real alarm. After a moment, he turned and went back inside the cabin, closing the door behind him. Clay released the breath he'd been holding. Justice trembled under his hands, every muscle taut with the need to charge forward, to finish what Grant had started. But the dog held position, discipline warring with instinct. "We need to move," Simon whispered. "Now, before he comes back out." They retreated carefully, putting distance between themselves and the cabin. When they'd gone far enough that speaking wouldn't carry, they stopped to regroup behind an outcropping of rock that provided cover and concealment. "That was too close," Simon said, his voice tight. "If Justice had barked, or if Blackwood had better eyes, we'd be in a fight we can't win." Clay nodded, but his mind was racing through options. Blackwood was right there, less than a quarter-mile away. By the time they hiked back to the trading post, sent someone for the sheriff, and brought back deputies, it would be morning at the earliest. Maybe longer if the weather turned bad. And in that time, Blackwood could be gone. "He might leave tonight," Clay said, voicing the thought. "If he's been moving this way like the sheriff said, staying ahead of the law, he might already be planning his next move. We could lose him, or we go back, get the sheriff, and catch him properly," Simon countered. "With the law, with proper authority. That's how Grant would want it done." Clay looked at Justice, who was staring back toward the cabin with unblinking focus. The dog knew his duty. 5 years of working with Marshal Grant had ingrained certain truths. Observe and report, track and contain, wait for backup before engaging dangerous suspects. But those same 5 years had also taught Justice that sometimes good men died waiting for backup. Grant's journal, Clay said suddenly. There was more in it. I didn't finish reading. They'd brought the oilskin-wrapped journal with them, not wanting to leave evidence at the site. Clay pulled it out now, handling it carefully, and flipped through the pages by the last light of day. Most of it was tracking notes, dates, and locations and patterns of behavior. But there were also personal observations, thoughts about Blackwood's psychology and methods. Listen to this, Clay said, finding an entry from 2 weeks before Grant's death. Subject demonstrates high-level tactical awareness. Former Army scout, possibly with combat experience. Familiar with counter-tracking techniques. Has evaded pursuit in 3 territories by staying mobile and maintaining no fixed base of operations. Pattern suggests he will abandon an area at first sign of coordinated law enforcement presence. Simon leaned in to read over Clay's shoulder. So if he knows the sheriff was here yesterday, knows people are looking for him, he'll run, Clay finished. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But soon, they continued reading. Grant had documented Blackwood's pattern in detail. The man would establish a temporary base, commit crimes in the surrounding area, and then vanish before law enforcement could coordinate a response. He was intelligent, methodical, and always 3 steps ahead. But there was another entry, dated just days before Grant's death, that made Clay's blood run cold. Subject has become more aggressive in recent weeks. Rather than avoiding confrontation, he now seems to seek it. The animal torture has increased in frequency and brutality. I believe he may be escalating toward a major incident, possibly planning to target humans directly. The pattern matches other cases I've studied of individuals who graduate from animal abuse to violence against people. Blackwood is becoming more confident, more bold. He wants to be known, wants his work to be seen and feared. This makes him both more dangerous and more predictable. He will not run forever. Eventually he will stand and fight, believing himself superior to those pursuing him. When that moment comes, extreme caution is required. He has demonstrated willingness to use any level of violence necessary. Clay closed the journal slowly. Grant knew. He knew Blackwood would eventually fight instead of run. And he was right. That's exactly what happened at that creek. Grant confronted him, and Blackwood murdered him. All the more reason to get the sheriff, Simon said. We're not lawmen. We're not trained for this. No, Clay agreed. But we're here now. And justice... He looked at the dog, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. Justice is trained for this. He knows what to do. And maybe we're not lawmen, but we're not helpless either. Simon was quiet for a long moment, and Clay could see him wrestling with the decision. Finally, the old trapper spoke. What are you proposing? We watch the cabin tonight. Take shifts, keep eyes on it, make sure he doesn't leave. At first light, one of us goes back to get the sheriff, while the other stays here with justice to maintain surveillance. If Blackwood tries to leave before help arrives, justice tracks him and we mark the trail. We don't engage unless absolutely necessary, unless it's a matter of preventing him from escaping or hurting someone else. That's still dangerous. Less dangerous than letting him disappear, and less dangerous than trying to take him ourselves. Clay met Simon's eyes. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking to do what Grant would have done. Maintain contact with the suspect until proper law enforcement can make the arrest. Simon considered this, then looked at Justice. The dog had settled slightly, but remained alert, professional. Grant trusted this dog with his life. Maybe we should too. They made camp well back from the cabin, in a position that allowed observation but provided cover. No fire, they couldn't risk the smoke or light giving away their position. They ate cold food from Simon's pack and took turns watching through gaps in the rocks. Blackwood's chimney continued to produce smoke as evening darkened to night, and lamplight glowed through the cabin's single window. Around midnight, Blackwood emerged to tend to his horse. Clay watched through the darkness as the man worked, his movements efficient and practiced. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his body and his environment. Nothing about him suggested guilt or fear. He was a predator in his own territory, certain of his safety. Justice tensed when Blackwood appeared, but Clay's hand on his back kept him quiet. The dog was learning to trust Clay's judgment, to work as a team rather than act on instinct alone. It was a remarkable thing to witness, this healing partnership forming between man and dog, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. After checking his horse and scanning the area one more time, Blackwood went back inside. The lamp remained lit for another hour, then was extinguished. Darkness settled over the cabin. "He's bedded down for the night," Simon whispered. "If we're going to send someone for the sheriff, now's the time," Clay nodded. "You go. You're faster. You know the trails better, and you can explain everything to Cole. Take Grant's journal. The sheriff needs to see it, needs to know what we found. I'll stay here with Justice and keep watch. You'll be alone. If something goes wrong, then I'll fire 3 shots in quick succession. You'll hear it even from the trading post. But nothing's going to go wrong. Blackwood thinks he's safe here. He'll sleep until dawn at least." Simon didn't look convinced, but he accepted the logic. 3 shots if there's trouble. And you absolutely don't try to take him alone. Your job is to watch and wait. Nothing more. "I understand." They shook hands, and Simon disappeared into the darkness, moving with the silent skill of a man who'd spent his life in the wilderness. Clay watched him go, then settled in with Justice to wait out the long hours until dawn. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead. Clay sat with his back against the rock, rifle across his lap, Justice pressed warm against his side. The dog was alert but calm, watching the cabin with steady patience. "You loved him," Clay said quietly to Justice. "Grant, you loved him and he loved you. That's why this matters so much. Not revenge. You're not driven by that. You're driven by loyalty, by the need to finish what your partner started." Justice looked at him, and Clay could have sworn the dog understood every word. "I get it," Clay continued, his voice soft in the darkness. "I lost someone too. My wife Sarah died 5 years ago, and I never got the chance to save her. Never got the chance to do anything that mattered. I've been drifting ever since, just existing, not really living. But then I found you, or you found me, and suddenly I have something worth doing again. Someone worth protecting." The dog leaned into him, offering comfort as much as receiving it. "Grant wrote about his wife and daughter," Clay said. "They're waiting in Denver, not knowing he's dead, not knowing what happened to you. When this is over, when we get Blackwood, we have to tell them. Have to let them know Grant didn't die for nothing, that his work mattered, that his partner survived and finished the job." Hours passed. The stars wheeled overhead. Once an owl called from nearby trees. Twice, deer passed through the area, and Justice noted them but didn't react. He knew the difference between wildlife and the human he was hunting. As dawn approached, gray light beginning to touch the eastern horizon, movement came from the cabin. Smoke started rising from the chimney again. Blackwood was awake, making fire, probably preparing breakfast. Clay checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded and ready. Not because he wanted to use it, but because he'd promised Dutch and Margaret he'd be careful. Because Justice deserved someone who wouldn't take foolish risks, who'd be smart and strategic. The cabin door opened, and Blackwood stepped out into the early dawn. He stretched, yawned, and moved to check his horse again. Completely at ease, completely unaware he was being watched. Justice's muscles bunched, and Clay felt the dog's heartbeat accelerate against his leg. Every instinct the animal had was screaming to attack, to bring down the man who'd murdered his partner. But the training held. Justice waited for the command that would never come, because Clay wasn't sending him into danger alone. Blackwood finished with his horse and went back inside. Minutes later, Clay smelled coffee and cooking meat. The man was settling in for a normal morning, apparently planning to stay another day at least. That was good. It meant time for Simon to reach the trading post, for the sheriff to organize his deputies, for proper law enforcement to arrive. It meant they'd done the right thing by waiting, by not rushing into confrontation. But it also meant long hours ahead of watching and waiting, hoping Blackwood didn't change his mind and decide to leave. Hours of keeping Justice calm and focused, maintaining their hidden position, fighting the cold and the urge to simply end this. Clay settled in for the long wait, his hand resting on Justice's shoulders. The dog was patient, professional, but Clay could feel the tension coiled in that powerful body. They'd found the man who'd killed Marshal Grant. They'd found where he was hiding. And now came the hardest part of any hunt, the waiting before the final moment. The sun rose higher, painting the mountains in gold and shadow. And in a stone cabin nestled in those mountains, a murderer made his breakfast, unaware that justice, the real kind, the patient kind, was finally closing in. The sun climbed higher, and Clay's legs cramped from staying in position. He shifted carefully, trying not to make noise, and justice adjusted with him. The dog had barely moved in hours, maintaining his watch with a discipline that reminded Clay why Marshal Grant had trusted him so completely. Around mid-morning, Blackwood emerged from the cabin again. This time he carried a rifle and moved with more purpose, scanning the tree line with sharper attention. Clay's breath caught. Had they been spotted? Had some sound or movement given away their position? Blackwood stood there for a long moment, completely still, his head tilted, as if listening. Then, without warning, he raised the rifle and fired toward the south, away from where Clay and Justice were hidden. The shot echoed through the mountains, and a moment later Clay heard something fall, a deer, probably. Blackwood had just been hunting for food. The man walked out of sight, presumably to retrieve his kill, and Clay allowed himself to breathe again. But Justice had gone rigid, every muscle locked. The sound of the rifle, the smell of gunpowder, something about it had triggered a response in the dog. "Easy," Clay whispered, his hand firm on Justice's back. "Not yet. We wait for the sheriff." But as morning stretched toward noon, with no sign of Simon returning with help, Clay began to worry. The trading post was 4 hours away at best, maybe 5 if the trail was difficult. Then the sheriff had to organize his deputies, gather supplies, and make the journey back. Even moving as fast as possible, they wouldn't arrive until late afternoon at the earliest. That meant at least 6 more hours of maintaining this position. 6 hours of hoping Blackwood didn't decide to leave. 6 hours of keeping Justice calm and hidden. Blackwood returned, dragging a small doe. He was methodical about field dressing it, working with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. Clay watched and found himself analyzing the man's movements, his demeanor. There was nothing obviously monstrous about him. He just looked like a man going about his business, hunting, preparing food, surviving in the wilderness. But Clay had seen the torture marks on Justice, had seen Ed Patterson's horses, had read Marshal Grant's journal entries about calculated cruelty. Evil didn't always look like evil from a distance. Sometimes it just looked ordinary. Around 1 o'clock, Blackwood's horse suddenly whinnied in alarm. The animal's head came up, ears forward, staring toward the northwest, the opposite direction from where Clay and Justice were hidden. Blackwood noticed immediately, dropping what he was doing and grabbing his rifle. Clay's stomach dropped. Something was coming. Another animal? A person? Or had the sheriff arrived faster than expected? Blackwood moved to the front of the cabin, rifle ready, eyes scanning the trees. His body language had completely changed, from relaxed to alert, from casual to dangerous. This was a man who knew how to fight, who'd survived by being faster and meaner than his opponents. Then Clay heard it, distant voices, the sound of multiple horses moving through the forest. The sheriff. It had to be. Simon must have pushed hard, and Sheriff Cole must have organized his deputies quickly, but they were approaching from the wrong direction, coming in from the northwest when Clay and Justice were positioned to the southeast. Blackwood would see them before they saw him, would have time to prepare, to set up an ambush, or to run. Clay made a split-second decision. He stood, breaking cover, and shouted across the clearing, "Silas Blackwood! You're surrounded! U.S. Marshal's office! Drop your weapon!" It was a lie. Clay had no authority, wasn't a marshal, and they definitely weren't surrounded. But he needed to divide Blackwood's attention, needed to prevent him from ambushing the sheriff's party. Blackwood spun toward Clay's voice, his rifle coming up fast. But he didn't fire immediately. Instead, his eyes locked onto Justice, who had stood beside Clay, and something flickered across Blackwood's face. Recognition, shock, and then, impossibly, amusement. "Well, I'll be," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "That's Tom Grant's dog. I left you staked out to freeze, mutt. How'd you survive that?" Justice's growl was low and menacing, a sound that promised violence. "You killed Marshal Grant," Clay shouted, moving slowly to better cover while keeping Blackwood's attention. "You tortured his dog and left him to die." "It's over, Blackwood. The law is here. Surrender now." "The law," Blackwood laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You mean Cole? I heard he was sniffing around, but I also heard he's still days away getting his deputies organized. So who are you? Some cowboy playing hero?" A shot rang out from the northwest, kicking up snow near Blackwood's feet. The sheriff's voice carried through the trees. "Drop the weapon, Blackwood. You're under arrest." Blackwood's expression hardened. He was trapped between Clay and Justice on one side and the sheriff's party on the other. For a moment, Clay thought he might actually surrender. The man was outnumbered, outgunned, with no escape route. But then Blackwood smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Clay's blood freeze. "You want me?" Blackwood shouted. "Come and get me." He fired toward the sheriff's position, then spun and fired toward Clay, not to hit, but to suppress. Then he was moving, running toward the cabin, using it as cover. More shots from the sheriff's deputies, but Blackwood had made it inside. Clay and Justice ran forward, using trees for cover, closing the distance to the cabin. They could hear the sheriff's party doing the same from the other side. Blackwood was trapped inside now, surrounded for real, but as Clay reached a position near the cabin's side wall, he realized the danger they were in. Blackwood had stone walls, supplies, and knew this building. He could hold out for hours, maybe days. And the longer this went on, the more likely someone would get hurt. Justice pressed against Clay's leg, and together they watched the cabin's door. Somewhere inside, Silas Blackwood was making his own calculations, deciding whether to fight or surrender. And Clay had a terrible feeling. He knew which way that decision would go. A standoff had begun. And Clay Jensen, who'd ridden into a blizzard for $3 just 2 weeks ago, found himself in the middle of a manhunt, with a dog at his side and a killer 30 yards away behind stone walls. The final confrontation Clay had been dreading was here, and there was no turning back now. Sheriff Cole's voice carried from the tree line. "Blackwood, there's no way out. Come out with your hands up and you'll get a fair trial." The response was another rifle shot, shattering a window shutter and sending splinters flying. Blackwood wasn't interested in surrendering. Clay pressed himself against the cabin's side wall, Justice at his feet. The dog was completely focused, not on the cabin's front where everyone's attention was directed, but on the back. Clay followed Justice's gaze and saw what the dog had noticed: a small door, probably leading to a root cellar or back exit that Blackwood might try to use. "Good boy," Clay whispered. "You know he'll run. You know his pattern." More shots exchanged between Blackwood and the sheriff's deputies. The standoff could last hours, but Clay didn't think it would. Men like Blackwood didn't wait patiently to be captured. They looked for opportunities, for weaknesses, for escape routes. And Justice had identified exactly where that escape attempt would come from. Clay signaled to the nearest deputy, a young man named Peters, who'd taken cover behind a thick pine. He pointed to the back of the cabin, then to himself and Justice, indicating they'd cover that exit. Peters nodded understanding and relayed the information to Sheriff Cole. The shooting continued sporadically from the front, Blackwood conserving ammunition, the deputies keeping him pinned. But Clay kept his attention on that back door, rifle ready, trusting Justice's instincts completely. Minutes crawled by. Then Justice's ears went forward, his body tensing. He'd heard something the humans couldn't. Movement inside the cabin, footsteps approaching that back door. Clay raised his rifle, aiming at the door, his heart hammering. This was it. Blackwood was going to make his move. The door burst open, and Blackwood emerged at a dead run, rifle in one hand, a pack in the other. He'd chosen escape over fighting, betting he could make it to the tree line before anyone could react, but he hadn't counted on Justice. The dog launched forward with explosive speed, 70 pounds of trained muscle and righteous fury. Blackwood saw him coming, tried to bring the rifle around, but Justice was too fast. The dog hit him full force, jaws clamping onto Blackwood's gun arm with precision that spoke of years of training. Blackwood screamed, dropping the rifle, trying to fight back. But Justice had been trained by one of the best law enforcement handlers in the territory. He knew exactly how to take down a suspect, where to bite, how much pressure to apply, how to control a much larger human without killing them. Clay ran forward, rifle trained on Blackwood. "Stop fighting! Stop or I'll shoot!" Blackwood tried to reach for a knife at his belt with his free hand, but Justice saw the movement and shifted, taking Blackwood completely to the ground. The man's face pressed into the snow, Justice's jaws still locked on his arm, immobilizing him completely. Sheriff Cole and his deputies came running, weapons ready. Cole took in the scene, Blackwood pinned, Justice in complete control. Clay standing guard, and a look of grim satisfaction crossed his face. "Release," Clay commanded, and Justice immediately let go of Blackwood's arm, though he remained standing over the man, ready to re-engage if necessary. Deputies swarmed in, pulling Blackwood's arms behind his back and securing them with heavy rope. The man was cursing, raging, but it was over. He was caught. Sheriff Cole knelt beside Blackwood, making sure the restraints were tight. Then he looked at the man's face. "Silas Blackwood, you're under arrest for the murder of U.S. Marshal Thomas Grant, along with multiple other charges of murder, torture, and robbery. You'll be transported to Territorial Prison to await trial." "That dog," Blackwood spat, blood running from his arm where Justice had bitten him. "That damn dog should be dead. I staked him out, left him in a blizzard, and he survived," Cole said coldly. "Animals have a way of being more resilient than the evil that tries to destroy them. Justice here finished what his partner started, and you're going to hang for it." The reality of his situation seemed to finally hit Blackwood. His rage dissolved into something uglier, self-pity and fear. But Clay felt no sympathy. This man had tortured Justice, had murdered Tom Grant, had killed innocent animals, and terrorized good people. While the deputies secured Blackwood and searched the cabin, Sheriff Cole walked over to where Clay stood with Justice. The dog had calmed now, sitting at Clay's side, though his eyes never left Blackwood. "You disobeyed my direct order," Cole said, but there was no anger in his voice. "I told you not to engage." "We didn't plan to," Clay said honestly. "We were just watching, waiting for you. But when your party approached, Blackwood was about to ambush you. I had to do something." Cole was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You saved lives today." "Mine, probably." "My deputies. And this dog," he looked at Justice with profound respect. "This dog did exactly what Tom Grant trained him to do. Tracked a fugitive, took him down without killing him, held him for arrest. That's professional law enforcement work," one of the deputies called from inside the cabin. "Sheriff, you need to see this." They went inside, leaving Justice with another deputy outside. The cabin's interior was exactly what Clay had expected, sparse, functional, and disturbing. Evidence of Blackwood's crimes was everywhere. Stolen items from various robberies, including personal effects that clearly belonged to Marshal Grant. A collection of wanted posters, including Grant's official notice about Blackwood. And in the corner, a crude forge and collection of branding irons, including one bent into the initials SB. "This is how he marked his victims," Cole said, his voice tight with disgust. "Branded them like cattle. Animals and humans both. They found journals, too, where Blackwood had documented his crimes with disturbing pride. It was more than enough evidence to convict him 10 times over as they prepared to transport Blackwood back to town. Sheriff Cole did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Marshal Grant's badge, the one they'd found at the creek. Cleaned carefully of blood and dirt, he walked over to where Justice sat waiting with Clay, and carefully attached the badge to Justice's collar using a leather strap. "This belonged to Tom Grant," Cole said quietly, his hands gentle as he secured it. "And I think he'd want his partner to have it. You finished the job, Justice. You brought your master's killer to justice, just like you were trained to do." Justice looked up at the badge, then at Clay, then at Sheriff Cole. And for the first time since Clay had found him dying in the snow, the dog's tail wagged. Just once, but it was enough. As they began the long trek back to civilization, Blackwood bound and walking between deputies, Clay walked beside Sheriff Cole with Justice at his side. The dog carried himself differently now, head high, that badge gleaming on his collar, the bearing of an officer who'd completed his mission. They'd done it. Against the odds, against danger, they'd brought a killer to justice. Not for revenge, not for glory, but because it was right. Because Marshal Thomas Grant deserved justice, and Justice the dog had made sure he got it. The mountains watched them pass, silent and eternal, holding their secrets. But one secret had been uncovered. One wrong had been made right. And the broke cowboy who'd thought his life had no meaning had discovered that sometimes purpose finds you when you're willing to sacrifice everything for what's right. 3 weeks passed, and spring began its slow arrival in the Wyoming Territory. Snow still covered the high peaks, but down in the valleys, the first green shoots were pushing through the frozen earth. The world was waking up, and so was Clay Jensen. He stood outside the trading post in the morning sunlight, watching Justice move through a tracking exercise. The dog's limp was almost gone now, just a slight hitch in his gait on cold mornings. The scars remained, they always would, but they'd healed clean and strong. "He looks good," Dutch said, coming to stand beside Clay. "Strong, healthy. You've done right by him." "He did more for me than I did for him," Clay said honestly. It was true. In the 3 weeks since Blackwood's capture, Clay had felt something shift inside himself. The aimless drifting that had defined his life since Sarah's death had been replaced by purpose. He woke up every morning with something to do, someone who depended on him, and a future that looked like more than just survival. Silas Blackwood was in territorial prison awaiting trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The stolen property, the journals, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the physical evidence Justice had led them to at the creek where Marshal Grant died. The trial would be a formality. Blackwood would hang before summer, but more important than Blackwood's fate was what had happened to the people his crimes had touched. Ed Patterson's horses had been the last animals tortured in the region. The atmosphere of fear that had gripped the community had lifted. People could sleep at night knowing the monster was caged. A horse and rider appeared on the trail from town, moving at an easy pace. As they got closer, Clay recognized Sheriff Cole. The lawman had been a regular visitor over the past weeks, checking on Justice's recovery and handling the legal aftermath of Blackwood's arrest. Cole dismounted and shook Clay's hand. "Got news," he said. "2 pieces. One you'll want to hear, one you might not. Let's have them both. Blackwood's trial is set for April 15th. Judge wants you and Justice there to testify. I know that's asking a lot, but your testimony about finding justice and tracking Blackwood will be important for the prosecution." Clay nodded. "We'll be there." Second piece of news. Cole pulled an envelope from his coat. Letter came from Denver. Mrs. Sarah Grant and her daughter Emily. "I wrote to them 3 weeks back, told them we'd found Justice alive and caught Tom's killer. This is their reply." Clay took the envelope, noting the careful handwriting on the outside. His hands felt unsteady as he opened it. The letter was written in a woman's elegant script. "Dear Mr. Jensen and Sheriff Cole, I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you have done. When Tom left for what would be his final assignment, he promised me he would be careful. He promised Justice would keep him safe. I know he kept his promise as best he could. And Justice tried his very best to protect him. Learning that Justice survived and helped capture Tom's killer has brought me a measure of peace I didn't think possible. My husband loved that dog like family, and I know the feeling was mutual. They were partners in the truest sense. Sheriff Cole has told me how you found Justice dying in the snow, how you risked your own life to save him, and how you both tracked down Silas Blackwood. Tom would have approved of you, Mr. Jensen. He always said good dogs knew good men, and Justice choosing to stay with you tells me everything I need to know about your character, which brings me to a difficult subject. Justice was Tom's partner for 5 years, and by rights he is part of Tom's estate. Emily and I have discussed this at length, and we both agree. Justice should stay with you. Tom would want him with someone who understands working dogs, who will give him purpose and respect his training. He's earned his rest, but I suspect Justice isn't ready to retire. He's a law enforcement dog in his heart, and that doesn't change just because his first partner is gone. So please, Mr. Jensen, if you're willing, keep justice. Love him as Tom did. Let him continue the work he was trained for. And know that you'll always have our gratitude and friendship. Tom's badge should stay with Justice. He earned it. With deepest appreciation, Sarah Grant and Emily Grant Clay had to read it twice, his vision blurring slightly. When he looked up, Sheriff Cole was watching him carefully. "She's giving me justice," Clay said, his voice thick. "Officially. He's mine, if you'll have him," Cole said. "And speaking of which, there's a job opening. County's expanding the deputy force, and we need someone to work the Northern Territory. It comes with a small salary, room at the county office, and authorization to use a tracking dog for law enforcement purposes." Cole's expression was neutral, but his eyes held warmth. "Job's yours if you want it. You've proven you can handle yourself, and Justice has proven he's still the best tracker in the region." Clay looked at Justice, who had finished his exercise and was sitting nearby, watching this conversation with interest. The dog's ears were forward, his posture alert and eager. This was an animal who needed work, who thrived on having a purpose, and Clay needed purpose too. "I accept," Clay said. "Both Justice and I accept." Cole smiled and extended his hand. They shook on it, and something in Clay's chest that had been tight for 5 years finally loosened. Later that afternoon, Dutch McGraw presented Clay and Justice with a gift. It was a custom leather collar, beautifully crafted, with words engraved into the leather. "Justice, hero of Deadwood Pass," along with the date of Blackwood's capture. "Can't have him wearing just a makeshift rope," Dutch said gruffly, clearly embarrassed by his own sentimentality. "A dog like this needs proper equipment." Margaret added a thick wool blanket dyed deep blue. "For cold nights on patrol," she said. "Can't have our deputy and his partner freezing." Clay attached the new collar, and Marshal Grant's badge fit perfectly on it, gleaming against the dark leather. Justice sat patiently while Clay worked, then stood and shook himself, the badge catching the sunlight. "Looks official," Simon observed, having stopped by for the occasion. "Like a real lawman." "He is a real lawman," Clay said. "Always has been." That evening, Clay and Justice walked up to the hillside overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Snow still crowned the peaks, but below the land was waking to spring. Clay thought about the night he'd ridden into the blizzard, desperate and broke, chasing $3. He thought about finding Justice staked out to die, about cutting those ropes with his father's knife, about nearly freezing himself. At the time, it had seemed like just another bad decision in a life full of them, but it had been the opposite. It had been the first right decision he'd made in 5 years. Everything good that had happened since flowed from that single choice, to stop, to help, to sacrifice for something beyond himself. Justice pressed against his leg, warm and solid and alive. The dog looked up at him, and Clay saw trust there, partnership, friendship. "Your partner Tom was a good man," Clay said quietly. "And he trained you well. I'll never replace him. I'm not trying to. But I promise you this. I'll give you the same respect, the same purpose, the same partnership he did. We'll do good work together. We'll protect people who need protecting and bring criminals to justice." Justice's tail wagged slowly, deliberately. "Understanding. We start patrols next week," Clay continued. "Sheriff Cole says there's a cattle rustling operation working the eastern valleys. Thinks your tracking skills might be exactly what we need to shut it down." The dog's ears perked up. Business, purpose, work. Clay smiled, feeling something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Contentment. Not happiness, not yet, but the foundation for it. The sense that his life had meaning again, that tomorrow held something worth waking up for. "You saved me," Clay said to Justice. "Just as much as I saved you. Maybe that's how it works sometimes. Maybe the best rescues are the ones that go both ways." They stood there as the sun set completely and stars began to appear. Man and dog, deputy and partner, two broken things that had found a way to be whole together. Behind them lay loss and grief and suffering. Ahead lay purpose and justice, and the hard, good work of making the world a little safer. Justice had his new collar, his badge, and his new partner. Clay had a job, a future, and a reason to keep going. And somewhere in Denver, Sarah Grant and her daughter could sleep, knowing that Tom's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that his partner continued the work, and that evil had been brought to account. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and coming spring. Clay put his hand on Justice's head, feeling the warmth of the dog beneath his palm. "Let's go home. A partner," he said, and together they walked down the hillside toward the lights of the trading post, toward the life they'd build together, toward all the tomorrows waiting to be lived. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and silent, and above, the stars wheeled on, bearing witness to one simple truth. Sometimes salvation comes not when we're looking for it, but when we choose compassion over convenience. When we stop for suffering we could ignore, when we cut the ropes that bind the innocent, even when it costs us everything. Clay Jensen had learned that lesson in a blizzard, with frozen fingers and a dying dog. And Justice had taught him that mercy, once given, has a way of coming back when you need it most. They were partners now, and their story was just beginning.